Migration has become a key issue in electoral campaigns all across Europe. The 2024 elections in European Parliament will be no exception to this. By framing migration as a key threat to our security, far-right parties seek to gain more seats in European Parliament. In this podcast episode today, we will put the European elections in perspective. We will discuss more generally how migration narratives play out in Brussels. Which kind of migration narratives are dominant in the EU today, and how do they actually have an influence on EU policymaking process? We are pleased to welcome two very qualified speakers for this team today. We have Florian Trauner, who's the co-director of the VUB Interdisciplinary Research Center on Migration and Minorities, or BIRMM. Florian also participated to the Bridges project on migration narratives during the last 3 years. And then we have Omar Ba. Omar Ba is a community organizer, an activist and a politician. He presented himself to the European Parliament election, and he has a 2 or 3 decades experience in the field of anti-racism and in anti-racist movements. My name is Gaia Romero. I'm also a member of the VUB BIRMM's group. And without further ado, let's go to the questions for our speakers.
This program is part of the Bridges podcast series produced by the Barcelona Center for International Affairs and funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 program.
Let's start with the issue of politicization of migration narratives. And on this, I will give the floor to Florian. Florian, can you tell us what politicization is in general and what politicization of migration narratives is in particular?
Yeah, thanks, Gaia, and happy to be on this podcast. Yeah, politicization is a concept relatively widely used in migration studies. And it's, in a way, you can understand it easily, I mean, migration is not an issue, like a health issue, a sport issue, whatever. Migration, today's societies, is considered in a different way. And in the academic, you say that it's often politicized, and that refers to two developments taking place in our societies. On the one hand, migration has become a very salient issue and a very polarized issue. A salient issue in the sense that everything is getting linked to migration, Schools are not working very properly, probably migrants are to blame, I don't know, housing is an issue, we don't have enough housing, probably too many migrants there. So this kind of discourses are put forward, in particular by far-right parties, who try to link everything to migration and to frame migration as a kind of a threat and the source of many of problems in our societies. So you don't look at housing as such, but you link it always there, and therefore you increase the salience of the issue. And the other thing is polarization. So by framing migration as a kind of a really existential issue, a kind of a security threat to our society, you increase a kind of a polarization in society. You try also, in particular far-right parties again, you try to mobilize your own electorate with the migration issue to bring them behind them. And how do you do so? You put forward relatively extreme position that, mobilize either in favor of your positions, but also against you. So you have a clear polarization in society that brings people more clear-cut against, or having a clear-cut stance on this or being against this.
And yes, thank you very much, Florian. And Omar, from your experience as an activist, as a politician, what do you think about this politicization of migration narratives, and especially how do you engage with it?
Thank you for having me here. I think that I've been following this kind of narrative since now more than 3 decades, even though I've been active since two decades. And far right have always been pointing migration as an issue. And for me, the biggest issue is not that far right only is having that narrative, but having the other classical political parties joining the narrative of far right and trying to implement certain policies to please a certain public opinion that has been educated, that has been influenced to think that migration is an issue. By example, Florian has been talking about housing issues. In Flanders, we see certain measures saying if you don't speak the language, you don't have the right to social housing, which is a fundamental right. By example, saying to somebody who is not working, who is unemployed, you don't have a right to a minimal support, when you don't speak the language or you don't show a kind of will to integrate in society. Those kind of things. And an indication of the shifting of the classical political parties into the narrative of far right. By example, I remember Angela Merkel once saying that multiculturality has failed. Is a sentence that she said, a sentence that echoed in all the European Union, and people saying, indeed, multiculturalism has failed because of migration, because of the influx. And then you had in France, by example, with Sarkozy, was almost 20 years ago, a narrative that was really close to far right to gain voices, and linking it to security issues, because migration, when you see a neighborhood with a lot of migrants, is related to insecurity, is related to crime, is related to violence. So this has been the narrative cultivated by far right 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and now who is included into the narrative of the main political field. So you will see people, even some politicians on the left, classical, who will have a narrative today and say, indeed, we cannot just stay silent on the issue of migration. We cannot stay silent on the issue of violence. Recently, the chairman of the left party in Belgium said that the Romas were an issue, that those brown people needed to get hit by police officers. He said it. And he resigned afterwards, after a lot of conversation and discussion into that political party. So for me, what I want to say is like, far right didn't change their narrative. But what did change is the acceptance of the narrative of far right as a reality that has been adopted by many political parties on the field, so much that it became the main stake for elections everywhere in the EU.
Mm-hmm. And as an activist, Omar, what can you do to counter these narratives?
As an activist, many activists have been doing a lot to counter that narrative. Counter that narrative, by example, by opposing to the narrative of far right science-based facts. That's why, by example, those kind of studies are really important, because sometimes far right is just throwing numbers in the air without any kind of verification, and people take it for true. By example, often they exaggerate the numbers of people coming into a country. They do it, is a classical, that one. And sometimes they exaggerate also the amount of people from minority backgrounds involved into crime, and so on and so on and so on. So always there is that exaggeration. So it's important for many organizations, for many people, also to oppose to that discourse science-based facts. So it helps. Not only that one, but also what do not help is just to point that far right is wrong without going into debate with them. Because some people say, if you debate with far right, because they just come with anecdotes, they come with simple slogans and simple answers to complicated questions. But if you let the field for them on certain issues, by example, on security issues, on schooling issues, and without addressing certain issue concerning those things, you let it just for far right. So they have a plain field to do what they want, and which they dominate. And that's why, by example, today we came to a point where they are not only dominating the narrative, but they are even defining policies, and they are influencing the whole spectrum of this political field to act as they wish. So I was saying, by example, 3 years ago into a newspaper, the Morgan, which is influential in Flanders, I said during an interview, I said the most influential politician in Flanders, and it's the same in France, is the same in Netherlands, is the same even in some other countries, is Philippe de Winter from Vlaams-Belang. He never went to power. He was always into opposition, but many of the points he have been raising have been adopted by other political parties, and they implemented it into policy. That's much more worse. Mm-hmm. So the biggest question is, far right, even if they don't occupy a leading position in power, their narrative is not only influencing the public opinion, but is also influencing their peers.
Yeah. Can I come in? It's very interesting what you say, because also in our study we saw that actually there are different kind of narratives. It's the political narrative, then there's the policy/technocratic narrative among the EU's institution, Commission, Parliament, and so on. But we saw really that sometimes this political narrative has a huge influence then in the policy technocratic narrative, and is also taking over in policy making. So there we can really see what you mentioned right now for the Flemish case, that this is sometimes the case also at European Union level. And with regard to the evidence-based, I think that's really one of the ideas in how you create a kind of an alternative narrative there. You really link it to numbers, you link it to facts, you also link it to values. EU values are of concern for EU citizens and rule of law, democracy. So you link it a bit on this, and you link it as well to things that are key or valuable for citizens. People want to be able to go to a restaurant and order something. They want to have a waiter there, and if this waiter is of foreign descent, it's not such a big thing, as long as they can still have the services. So you link migration to labor needs, demography, and other things. Another interesting finding still, what Bridges project showed, was that people actually react very positively to testimonials. So they identify. The question of identification is also very important. And we can see that migration narratives are very rarely actually done by migrants themselves. It's very often about migration. So migrants themselves have not a voice. So I think if you can increase the standing, the role, the importance of migrants in a migration narrative, that's also something that contributes to more alternative narratives in the migration field.
It's interesting what you're pointing here, because I just want to jump on it with two remarks. Indeed, what you say, I remember when Ursula von der Leyen occupied a function, and there were the redistribution of posts as European commissioners. There was one commissioner who had the task to rethink about the way of life, the European way of life. It was a big conversation of what do you mean with defending our way of life. And if you look at the origin of this word, defending our way of life, this is typically a word used by far right, So just to talk about the implementation of it. And the second thing you're addressing here, so you have indeed, by example, when migrants, when you have testimonies, because those testimonies are testimonies of human beings, testimonies of people. Stories of people who wants to support their families, who fled of war or certain situations. So people, like you say, really identify themselves to the situations that is a reality for many of those people coming here. And what I want to say on this is like, far right is dehumanizing people, the dehumanization of the migrant individual. And it's important to humanize the migrant again, to humanize the migrant, and also to, because people are making an amalgam. There is not a difference between the migrant coming and the migrants who have been living here for like 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So far right, when they say migrant, they don't only talk about the people who are coming, they talk also about the people who are living here, the minorities, who are not migrants no more, who are people from first, second, third, fourth generation. So there is a link between the two. So for them, for far right, the problem is minorities, colored people, religious communities, or religious minorities, and those are the questions that they address. And by example, in 2015, when you saw the flux of Syrians coming into Europe, what happened? Far right was saying, "Oh, now we are threatened by potential terrorists." It was the keywords at that time. So who are we getting into our countries? Now we are threatened. Now the Islam is coming. Now soon we're going to be the European Caliphate. Those kind of words were coming in. And at that exact time, you had the rise of ISIS in Syria. People were seeing every day people being beheading and so on and so on. So they made an association of migrants and terrorists. And until today, you still have that narrative going on. And that's where this question of defending our values, defending our way of life, and all those questions are strategically associated with each other just to dehumanize the migrants, to install fear.
You already mentioned some of the main narratives about migration in Europe. Florian mentioned that one of the main narratives is about migrants to be a threat to our security. That's also what Omar was saying. But you also mentioned that there are also counter-narratives, for example, narratives that are created by the migrants themselves. So my next question is, just to really clarify what we're talking about, which ones would you say that are the leading narratives about migration in Europe now? And who creates these narratives? You mentioned policymakers and you mentioned migrants, but is there anyone else?
Yeah, first to start, if you have a policymaker who is raising the voice, his or her voice on the migration theme, it's not a narrative by such. That's an input to a public debate. A narrative is something that we understand as more stable. It's really something that repeats, and you can add individual events into a wider narrative. So narratives, they develop over time. They usually have a kind of a plot with causes, and there are always these victims, villains, or heroes. And then, you can use, for instance, the far right, there's always this framing, migrants are a threat, they are more the villains. The heroes are the kind of, the politicians able to speak out against an elite and protecting the citizens. So that's more the far right, security-driven narrative. Then you have a narrative that is putting more, migrants as victims themselves, and saying, they have a good reasons to come here, to flee here. And so it's a narrative that puts migrants in the center of the debates. And in the EU level, you have also you have a narrative that is putting more states in the role sometimes of villains or victims, villains or victims, for instance, because they don't have enough solidarity. Think of Italy and Greece, and they have high number of arrivals. So you have a narrative on migration that is concerning a lot. How can we help the states? How can we help the populations of border countries? How can we help? And the migrants there, they are part of the subject, but it's really more from state to state or from government to government. So these are a bit the narratives that we see there. The question, who is creating then? You have certainly, on the one hand, media, traditional social media. You have political actors, political statements. So in our research project, we looked a bit on what is actually driving narratives. I don't want to monopolize the discussion here. I think you have to say something as well. But it's interesting because, for instance, social media in the Bridges project, we found out social media is reinforcing narratives in one way or another, in a liberal or in a security. But many of the narratives, they are still up until today very much created or have the foundation in traditional media. So traditional media have a really important source, in particular at member state level, for understanding how narratives develop or are really their foundation. And then social media is more the reinforcing tool there. I mean, you have, politicians with the populist parties in particular, they are very powerful in narratives because they have this constant narrative, as Omar said, over years and years, and they manage to put other parties in their kind of narrative, so that they have to adapt there. I will stop there.
And it's true, and often people overlook that fact that far right have been cultivating this since a long time, and what happened now is that far right created a frame. A frame created certain words, and those words are being used and used again on the question of far right. But as you say, the narratives now is, for example, when you see in Italy why the elections far right have won. And now, by example, in France, you saw that the French government, which is not a far-right government, wanted to introduce a new law on migration, a set of laws that have been rejected by the parliament. But those laws, if you look into those laws and the proposals, you see many points that have been supported by far-right before. So that question of policy making that you're saying, so the influence. So people have been underestimating always the influence, and they are focusing on the fact that we have to block far right from acceding to power. But if you block far right from acceding to power, but you don't counter the narrative, you have a far right that is educating the general population, the public opinion, and right now today, the worst thing that is happening now is you have an internalization of far right, thanks before to the rise of Donald Trump, the alt-right movement, and so on. So what do you see now? You see even the narrative, the words they choose, they organize seminars. Alt-right in the US meets or far-right in Flanders or far-right in Spain or in Italy. They even meet in Poland. Sometimes they have training camps in Oranjestad in South Africa because they still have some acquaintances with some nostalgic of the apartheid movement. So you have an internationalization of far-right, and they are learning to synchronize their narrative. By example, there is one word that was never used 20 years ago or 30 years ago, is our European values. You had Scottish values, you had German values, you had French values, but now we have European values. We have European cultures. While Europe is so diverse, and 30 years ago, I don't think that the Scottish was associating themselves to their neighbors, in the UK. So, and of the Irish, or the Catalan, and so on and so on and so on. So now, and this defending our values, defending our culture, and even now they opposing it by example by saying, oh, the rise of wokeism. Wokeism has been the new thing. Our whiteness is threatened. Those kind of conversation you're having. So when and far right have been long time underestimated, but they are successful into really shaping the debate and influencing the vernacular narratives of people here. And I think that's why, by example, I liked what Florian said. It's important to have an alternative conversation than the opposing, and that's the media role, the media which creates a platform which oppose far right and the rest. And instead of creating a platform where you have different voices talking about different issues in society without culturalizing those problems, without linking those issues to migration necessarily, because violence issue is not necessarily a migration issue, or vice versa, or a problem in schools those are policy problems. Those are problems that are inherent to any society everywhere. The problem of urbanization and cities that grows, and violence of cities, of drugs abuse, and so on, is not migration. Is is just an evolution which can be traced, but those stories are not told. And indeed, we had a project about narratives, and I had conversation with the Bridges Project once about it. Is because we say let's give a platform to all the conversation that the population is having, even those people believing far right, and those people who are opposed to far right, and those people who are in the middle doubting, and confront them to what they believe, to those myths, confront them to those ideas who are not science-based ideas, confront them to those new mythologies that are being built by far right, and also confront them to the fact that far right, who pretend to have a political project, always point a problem but never proposes solutions to economy, to school, to healthcare, to so on and so on. But they know for them the problem is migration, because everything is migration. Even economy is migration. The air that we breathe is not clean because of migration, and so on. Huh?
Yeah. But I mean, just to add, I mean, it's super important what they say. It's this kind of bottom-up initiatives that are important to complement or to have a kind of a different debate there. Just say, I mean, that's important to complement, but I think as well, we should really avoid this trap, as I mentioned earlier, also by the media, not that they always frame or they take over the framing of far right to link too many issues with migration and not scratch on the surface what is actually behind it. So I think the media does have a role, and the media will have a role as well in the forthcoming European election there. And the European institutions and the European debate is a bit of particular, because until recently, you could say you didn't have a really public debate on a European level, a transnational, or not such a strong one. I mean, right now you start to have powerful European media, Politico, EU Observer, Euroactive, but still they are more reporting what is happening. They're not so much framing a debate like you have it with some media outlets in national level. So that's also, I mean, the European debate is is different in the sense that the national debate is already more polarized, and it's just about to spilling over the European debate and the institutional things, what's going on there, I would say.
And you both spoke mainly about negative narratives about migration, but I guess that there are probably also positive narratives, for example, welcoming the refugees as a question of solidarity, as a question of a moral issue. What can you tell us about these positive narratives about migration?
I think it's really important also to, because in 2015, in opposite to what people would think, in Belgium, by example, and in other countries too, in France, in Germany, you had a massive influx of migrants, and far right discourse was really intensified, but we saw a wave of solidarity toward the migrants. People welcoming migrants in their homes. People helping those migrants. In Brussels here, by example, in front of the station, you had people distributing foods after they work to come. And those people were people sometimes who live in really rural areas, people who are never confronted even to minorities. But they saw the humanitarian disaster, and they showed also that European societies, even though you have a strong narrative of far right, the European society are fundamentally human and fundamentally solidar also when it comes to be solidar. And you see it in different parts of Europe, those kind of things. So, and another thing is also, by example, in some countries you have the moral discourse that works better than in some other countries. By example, I know that in Flanders, when you address the issue and you make it a moral issue, you will have the opposite effect. So in every European culture, you have cultural differences. You have debate cultures who are different. You have also narratives you have different declination of narratives. So it's important also to know that you cannot have like a European narrative norm that can be diffused all over the place. You have to have like local initiatives, and you have a lot of them in Spain, in Italy. You see it, by example, a mayor of a village who support migrants, who try to regularize them. You see it in Italy, in the rural areas of Italy. You see in France, by example, a lot of media are showing employers who are fighting to support one of their employers because the employers have documentary issues. So people are solidar.
Yeah, and if I can come in, because in our British report, one of the case studies was the Ukrainian influx of refugees. And there we could also see actually a narrative that was really characterized by solidarity. What is interesting, I mean, there's record numbers of people coming in a short time period, but it was never really framed as a migration crisis. Actually, the Ukrainian influx was not framed or narrated, if you want to say so, as a migration issue at all. It was seen as a geopolitical challenge by Russia on Ukraine and Europe at large. And the migration issue was one issue aside, military, economic, energy, whatever you name it. And it was, there was a real wish as well from the population, but also from politicians to show solidarity. And the solidarity narrative very quickly dominated, and it was also quickly transformed into real policies, this temporary protection regime for Ukrainians. So that was actually a relatively positive narrative there.
So we should depoliticize migration narratives to let the positive narratives come out.
Yeah, I think that could be a good idea.
But real fast, I think the Ukrainian nobody saw it as a migration issue, but because it was a European issue, and it was also a you had like a non-white issue and a white issue. That has to be said, and it's really clear on that. But now things are shifting. You have more and more voices in different European countries and even far right, who are calling Ukrainians to go back because you have safe areas. Which is a bad news, by the way, which is inhumane, which is not considerate toward those people who are suffering.
Mm-hmm. And yes, so to conclude this discussion, we said that yes, maybe we should depoliticize migration narratives, but what else can be done?
I think that what the Bridge project, what the BIRMM project is doing, I think there should be more and more. These studies should be, and the conclusions of these studies should be widely spread among policymakers, widely spread in education institutions, so that people just realize that migration is a complex issue, is a human issue, a universal issue, a complex issue also, and for people to really make the difference between the propaganda of far right and the reality of migration. And I think also one thing that has to be encouraged is personal, individual, local initiatives that needs to be more displayed into media platforms and in others, so that people can see a reality and accompanied also with a consistent narrative on just including people who are here, supporting them, because migration for me is not a problem, it's an asset for Europe.
Yeah, no, I mean, please let me here conclude with a shameless promotion of the Bridges project, in the sense, because we have in so many reports with so many also policy recommendations, we really try to make it policy relevant. Some of the points have been mentioned about alternative migration narratives, but I think there's much more that could be done. So if anyone is interested, go into these different materials. It's on member states, it's on the EU's level, it's on migrant and migration organizations directly.
Thank you very much. So everyone should read the Bridges project output. But thank you very much, Omar. Thank you very much, Florian, for being here today with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
This program is part of the Bridges podcast series, produced by the Barcelona Center for International Affairs and funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 program.